We were told these were heroes, role models, moral giants, proof that faith makes people better. But what if some of their stories raise uncomfortable questions? Not small details, not historical debates, red flags, moments that feel manipulative, violent, ethically twisted. And here's the strange part. Most of us were trained not to notice. Tonight, we're not mocking, we're not attacking. We're doing something more dangerous. We're reading carefully. Because when you slow down, some of these heroes look very different. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Abraham, the father who was ready to kill. Abraham is called the father of faith, the prototype of trust, the man who stepped into the unknown because he believed the voice was real. That label sounds noble until you slow down and sit with the most disturbing scene in his entire story. He is told to offer his son, not to risk him, not to protect him, to raise a knife over him and turn devotion into blood. And what makes it chilling is not only the command, it is Abraham's response. The text does not show a moral wrestling match. There is no recorded outrage, no desperate plea, no moment where he says, "This cannot be right." The story moves like obedience is automatic, like the highest form of goodness is silence. Imagine that scene outside a sacred book. A father wakes his child early, travels for days, gathers wood, builds an altar, and binds his son. The child asks the question every child would ask: "Where is the sacrifice?" And the father answers with a line that sounds spiritual but lands like a warning: "God will provide." Now think about what faith becomes in that moment. Not compassion, not protection, not wisdom. Faith becomes compliance under pressure. It becomes a willingness to override the most basic human instinct in the name of a higher authority, and that is why this story raises a red flag. Because it teaches a dangerous lesson if you extract it from its ancient framing. Yes, the angel stops him. Yes, many believers say the point was that God never wanted the child dead, but the test still required Abraham to be willing. The moral center is not, "Do not kill." The moral center is, "Obey even when it feels unbearable." So the real question is not whether Abraham is a hero. The real question is what kind of world you create when obedience is praised more than conscience. Because once you accept that principle, you have opened the door to every cruel act that someone can dress up as a divine command. And the uncomfortable truth is this: Abraham's story is not an exception, it is a template. And from here, the pattern only gets darker. Lot, protecting angels, offering daughters. Lot is described as righteous, not average, not flawed, but decent, righteous, a man worth rescuing when judgment falls on an entire city. That is the frame we are given before the most disturbing moment of his story unfolds. Two visitors arrive in Sodom. A mob gathers outside his house. They demand the men be brought out. The scene is tense, chaotic, ugly, and in that moment, Lot steps outside and closes the door behind him. It feels like courage at first, a man protecting his guests from violence. But then he speaks. He tells the crowd he has daughters. He offers them instead. Slow down and let that register. A father presents his own children as substitutes. He calls it protection of hospitality. He calls it preserving honor. But the cost is his daughters' safety, their dignity, their humanity. We are told the city was wicked, that Sodom had rotted from the inside, that judgment was inevitable. Yet in the middle of that corruption stands the one man labeled righteous, and his moral instinct is to sacrifice his daughters to shield strangers. That is not a minor detail, that is a red flag. Some argue this was cultural, that hospitality in the ancient world was sacred, that Lot was trapped in an impossible situation. But culture does not erase the decision, pressure does not erase the offer. And righteousness that collapses under social expectation raises hard questions about what righteousness actually means. Notice something else. The angels intervene. The daughters are not harmed in that moment. The story moves on quickly. Fire falls from the sky. Lot is rescued. The narrative shifts to divine judgment. But the offer remains. And here's the deeper tension. If this is the best man in the city, what standard are we working with? If righteousness can include offering your children to a mob, what exactly is being measured? Sometimes the Bible condemns a city, but if you look carefully, the spotlight exposes the hero too. And once you start noticing that pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. Moses, law, plagues, and mass death. Moses is remembered as the liberator, the man who stood before empire and refused to bow, the shepherd who confronted Pharaoh and demanded freedom for his people. It is one of the most powerful liberation stories ever told. But slow the story down. Look past the triumph. Look at the cost. The plagues begin. Water turns to blood. A river becomes undrinkable. Fish die. Crops fail. Disease spreads. Darkness swallows the land. Livestock collapse. And finally, the most devastating blow of all. The firstborn children die in a single night. Not just the guilty, not just the powerful, children. And here's the line that makes this harder to ignore. The text says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, not once, but repeatedly. Pharaoh resists, but his resistance is reinforced. His stubbornness becomes part of the plan, which means the suffering does not simply happen. It unfolds step by step, escalation by escalation, with full awareness that it will continue. If a leader today unleashed disasters to pressure a government, knowing innocent families would suffer, we would not call it righteous strategy. We would call it collective punishment. We would call it disproportionate force. We would ask whether the ends justify the means. And yet, in this story, the means are framed as holy. Yes, the Israelites are enslaved. Yes, Pharaoh is oppressive. Liberation matters. But the question remains: why must the path to freedom run through escalating catastrophe inflicted on an entire population? Then the story moves again. The sea parts. The people escape. And when Pharaoh's army follows, the waters close. Soldiers drown. The narrative celebrates victory. But liberation is only the beginning. Because once the people are free, conquest comes next. New commands, new battles, new bloodshed in the name of promise. So the unsettling thought lingers. When power is absolute and declared divine, who decides what is justice and what is excess? And if hardening a ruler's heart is part of the design, where does responsibility truly lie? That tension does not disappear. It only grows stronger from here. Joshua. Divine conquest. Joshua steps into the story as the faithful successor. Moses is gone. The wilderness years are over. The promise is within reach. The land is described as a gift, an inheritance, a destiny waiting to be claimed. Then the walls of Jericho fall. It is dramatic, cinematic. Trumpets sound. The city collapses. But once the dust settles, the language shifts. Everything that breathes is destroyed. Men, women, children, livestock. Not caught in crossfire, not unintended casualties, devoted to destruction. And it does not stop with one city. Campaign after campaign follows. Towns burned, populations erased. The justification is consistent. Divine judgment. The inhabitants are corrupt. Their practices are evil. The land must be cleansed. Here is the tension we cannot ignore. If morality is objective and unchanging, if right and wrong are rooted in eternal truth, why does this look so much like total war? Why does it resemble the very atrocities we condemn in other chapters of human history? Some argue that the culture of the time was brutal, that warfare was always ruthless, that these accounts are exaggerated in ancient style. But even if that is true, the framing still matters. The violence is not described as tragic necessity. It is described as obedience. That detail changes everything. Because when destruction is commanded from above, questioning becomes rebellion, doubt becomes disloyalty, and conscience becomes secondary to compliance. And if the defense is simply that God said so, then we have opened a door that history has walked through many times. Leaders claiming divine mandate, armies convinced they are instruments of judgment, entire groups labeled unworthy of mercy. History has seen that logic before. It does not end with peace. But the red flags here are not only about physical violence, they are psychological. What happens to a community that learns to silence empathy in order to fulfill a command? What happens to moral instinct when it is trained to yield to authority without hesitation? Joshua's story is not just about ancient battles, it is about the terrifying power of certainty, and that certainty will echo in the stories that follow. Job, a test case for suffering. Job is introduced as righteous, upright, blameless, a man who fears God and avoids evil. The narrative goes out of its way to establish his integrity before anything goes wrong. He is not reckless, not corrupt, not secretly immoral. And then everything collapses. His livestock are stolen, his servants killed. A storm crushes the house where his children are gathered. In a single sweep, they are gone. Later, his body breaks down, skin covered in sores. Sleep replaced by pain. He sits in ashes, scraping himself with pottery. Why does this happen? Not because of hidden sin, not because of poor choices, because of a wager, a conversation in the heavenly realm where Job becomes a test case. Remove the blessings, the accuser suggests, and he will curse you. Prove it, comes the response. Pause there. Job never volunteers. He never agrees to be an example. His life becomes evidence in an argument he does not even know exists. When he finally speaks, he does not pretend. He curses the day he was born. He demands an explanation. He asks the question any honest person would ask: what did I do to deserve this? And when the answer comes, it is not an explanation. It is a display of power, a whirlwind, a series of questions about the foundations of the earth and the boundaries of the sea. Where were you when the world was made? Can you command the stars? The message is clear. You are small, I am vast. Here is the uncomfortable thought. Is faith stronger when it is chosen in freedom or when it survives terror? If loyalty must be proven through devastation, what kind of relationship is being modeled? Some will say Job is about trust beyond understanding. That suffering refines belief. But the red flag remains. A righteous man is broken to settle a cosmic dispute. And before we rush to blame only the divine, notice something else. Job's friends arrive. They speak with confidence. They insist suffering must mean guilt. They defend the system at all costs. Sometimes the red flags are not only in heaven, they are in the human need to justify pain, to protect theology, even if it crushes the person in front of us. And that instinct does not end with Job. David, a man after God's own heart. David begins as the unlikely hero, a shepherd boy facing a giant while trained soldiers hide. He wins with a stone and a sling, courage under pressure, faith over fear. It is the kind of story that builds legends. He writes poetry that still moves people thousands of years later. Psalms of longing, psalms of repentance, psalms of fierce devotion. He dances before the ark. He refuses to harm the king who hunts him. When he finally becomes king, it feels earned. And then the camera shifts. One evening, he sees Bathsheba bathing. He sends for her. The text is brief, almost clinical. He takes her. She becomes pregnant. Her husband Uriah is away fighting in David's army, loyal and unaware. David tries to cover it up. He calls Uriah home, hoping he will sleep with his wife and assume the child is his. Uriah refuses out of solidarity with his fellow soldiers, so David escalates. He sends orders to the front lines. Place Uriah where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw support. Uriah dies. It is not impulsive rage, it is calculated, power used to satisfy desire, authority weaponized to erase evidence, a king arranging death through paperwork. Call it what it is: abuse of power, sexual exploitation, state-sponsored murder. And yet David is still remembered as a man after God's own heart. Yes, a prophet confronts him. Yes, he repents. He writes a psalm of remorse. The child born from the affair dies. Consequences unfold. But ask yourself something uncomfortable. If a modern leader used his position to take a woman and orchestrate her husband's death, would repentance restore his moral credibility? Would poetic apologies outweigh the harm? Or are we tempted to protect the hero, because the story needs him to remain chosen. David's life is complex. He is brave and broken, devoted and dangerous. But when we elevate him, without fully reckoning with the severity of his actions, we risk sending a subtle message. That charisma plus confession equals restoration of status. And if that logic feels familiar, it should. Because the tension between wisdom and integrity does not end with David, it deepens in the next generation. Solomon. Wisdom without integrity. Solomon is introduced as the golden child of the monarchy. When offered anything he desires, he asks for wisdom. Not wealth, not revenge, wisdom. It sounds pure, almost humble, and the story rewards him. His judgments astonish the nation. His proverbs circulate like distilled truth. His poetry explores love, meaning, vanity, time. He becomes the symbol of divine insight poured into a human mind. Nations visit him. Queens travel long distances just to test his understanding. His kingdom expands. His wealth multiplies. Gold piles up. Influence grows. Everything appears to confirm that wisdom leads to blessing. But then the details begin to stack up. 700 wives, 300 concubines, political alliances sealed through marriage after marriage, relationships turned into strategy, intimacy turned into diplomacy, desire blurred with power. And the text says his heart was led astray. The wisest man alive builds altars to other gods to accommodate the beliefs of his foreign wives. The king who wrote about fearing the Lord allows divided devotion to take root in his own house. That is not a small contradiction. It is a fracture at the center of the story. Here is the irony. The same narrative that celebrates wisdom also warns constantly against divided loyalty. Guard your heart, avoid temptation, do not chase excess. Yet the character who teaches these principles slowly embodies their opposite. How does the wisest man become compromised by appetite? Some will say wisdom is not the same as discipline. That knowledge does not guarantee obedience. But that explanation does not remove the tension. It intensifies it. Because if wisdom itself cannot safeguard integrity, what can? And notice how familiar this feels. Leaders who speak brilliantly about virtue while quietly eroding it, public insight paired with private indulgence, admiration sustained by reputation long after cracks appear. Sometimes the people we are told to admire are not blueprints for success. They are cautionary tales about the slow drift of the human heart. Solomon's life whispers a warning beneath the praise. Insight without restraint becomes self-deception. Power without limits becomes corrosion. And if that unsettles you, it should. Because the final character we must examine does not rule a kingdom. He builds something even more enduring. Paul. Conversion and control. Paul begins as an enemy of the movement he would later define. A persecutor, a zealot, convinced he is defending truth. Then comes the dramatic reversal on the road to Damascus. A blinding light, a voice, a new mission. It is one of the most powerful conversion stories in religious history. And from that moment, Paul becomes unstoppable. He travels relentlessly, city to city, synagogue to marketplace. He debates philosophers. He writes letters that circulate beyond his physical presence. He reframes a small Jewish sect centered on a crucified teacher into a universal message aimed at the entire Roman world. It is strategic brilliance, theology adapted for Gentiles, rituals simplified, identity redefined. In many ways, Christianity, as we know it, carries his fingerprints everywhere. But read his letters slowly. Women are instructed to remain silent in certain assemblies. Wives are told to submit. Slaves are urged to obey their masters. Believers are warned against false teachers, against dissent, against stepping outside the boundaries of approved doctrine. Unity matters deeply to Paul, but unity is not left to chance. It is guarded, structured, reinforced through authority. This is where the red flag flickers. Paul is not only proclaiming good news, he is organizing communities, establishing leadership roles, defining orthodoxy, drawing lines between insiders and outsiders. He is not just spreading a message. He is constructing a framework strong enough to survive opposition. And frameworks require more than inspiration. They require hierarchy, rules, accountability, control. Some will argue this was necessary, that movements collapse without order, that clarity protects truth. And perhaps that is partly true. But here is the unsettling question. When you read modern Christianity, when you hear sermons, when you observe church structure, whose voice echoes louder? The parables of Jesus about love and mercy, or the detailed instructions of Paul about conduct and submission? How much of what millions call Christianity is shaped by the teacher from Galilee, and how much is shaped by the theologian who systematized him? That question has divided scholars, pastors, and believers for centuries. And once you ask it honestly, the foundation feels less simple than it once did. This is not about tearing down belief. It is about reading without flinching. Because when we elevate flawed figures and refuse to name the flaws, we quietly normalize them. Violence becomes sacred when authority approves it. Obedience starts to outrank conscience. Power can be washed clean with the language of repentance. The Bible is complex, ancient, deeply human. That is exactly why it deserves serious engagement, not automatic defense. When a story raises a red flag, ignoring it does not protect faith. It weakens it. It trains us to look away instead of think. And maybe that is the deeper concern. Not that these characters were imperfect, but that questioning them was treated as disloyalty. If faith is true, it will not collapse under scrutiny. If morality is real, it will endure examination. So read carefully, slow down, ask harder questions. And if you value truth over comfort, subscribe. Thinking deeply is not rebellion. It is responsibility.